A quiet courtroom suddenly turns tense as a powerful figure throws out a sharp, unexpected question, one clearly meant to shake the person sitting across from him. The room falls silent. Eyes shift. You can feel the weight of the moment. But instead of backing down, something unexpected happens. A calm voice responds, not just with confidence but with something far more dangerous, undeniable brilliance. What happens next leaves everyone stunned. And it all started with one bold attempt to intimidate the wrong person. In any legal setting, authority is often seen as a tool to guide the conversation, shape the outcome, and establish control. When a highly respected figure takes the stage in a formal setting, especially a courtroom, their words often carry weight. They are accustomed to their position of power and use it not only to assert their control, but also to test those who may be less experienced or younger. These seasoned professionals sometimes see themselves as gatekeepers, ready to challenge anyone who dares to question or stand in their way. This dynamic plays out in the most subtle yet powerful ways during important discussions or hearings. The situation becomes even more intense when the person being tested is someone who has earned their place despite being younger or less known. In one particular instance, a seasoned and highly influential figure, known for their position and authority, decided to put their influence to the test. Their approach to the situation was not one of collaboration, but of challenge. The goal, it seemed, was to measure the resolve and abilities of the person in front of them by pushing them into a difficult corner. It was not a friendly debate, but a calculated move to assert power and see if the other party would buckle under pressure. This figure believed their authority alone would make the opponent hesitate or falter, expecting them to show signs of weakness. The questioning started strong, as expected. It was direct, probing, and carried a tone that suggested the other party should be prepared to justify every point they made. The questions came quickly, one after the other, each designed to test the strength of the legal knowledge and ability of the person being questioned. They weren't just any questions, but ones meant to intimidate. The seasoned professional sought to throw the other party off balance, using their experience and stature to create a sense of pressure. With each question, the energy in the room began to shift, not from genuine curiosity, but from an attempt to assert dominance in the conversation. However, there was something the seasoned professional did not anticipate. The person they were challenging wasn't intimidated. Instead of appearing unsure or hesitant, they responded in a manner that was completely composed. Each answer given was clear, precise, and deeply rooted in legal understanding. They didn't just respond to the questions, they broke them down. With every answer, they demonstrated an impressive command over legal principles and showed a strong grasp of the subject matter. What began as a pressure-filled interaction soon began to shift in the opposite direction. The seasoned professional was caught off guard. They had expected their authority to shake the confidence of the person being questioned, but instead they found themselves on the defensive. The responses came with such confidence and clarity that it was impossible to dismiss them. What had started as an attempt to assert dominance quickly turned into a lesson in legal knowledge. The questions that were designed to rattle the other party became opportunities for them to showcase their deep understanding of the law. The situation was no longer just about questioning. It had become a space for the younger individual to demonstrate their legal expertise. As the back and forth continued, the room's atmosphere began to change. What had initially seemed like an uneven fight, a battle between authority and experience, had shifted in a way no one had expected. The seasoned professional, once confident in their position, now seemed uncertain. They had expected to dominate the conversation, but instead they had discovered that their attempt to intimidate had only highlighted the strength of the other party. The questioning that had started with a sense of superiority now seemed more like an invitation for the other individual to step into the light. The power dynamics were no longer clear-cut. It was no longer about who had more years of experience or who could control the narrative with their position. The real power had shifted to the person being questioned, who had proven themselves through calm, confident, and well-reasoned responses. What had begun as a test of endurance had turned into a showcase of intellectual strength. The room, once tense and filled with the air of dominance, had become filled with respect for the person answering the questions. This moment was a reminder of something fundamental in the legal world and beyond. Authority is not simply about status or experience. True power lies in knowledge, clarity of thought, and the ability to stand firm in the face of pressure. Even when confronted with attempts to rattle or intimidate, the strength of one's ideas and expertise can transform the situation. What began as an effort to use power and position to intimidate became a display of what happens when true mastery of a subject is brought to the table. This shift in power was more than just a lesson in legal knowledge. It was a demonstration of how intellectual strength can reshape the way people interact with one another, especially in high-pressure situations. It showed that no matter how intimidating someone might appear, it is possible to stand your ground, respond with confidence, and let your understanding of the matter speak for itself. What was intended to be an intimidating encounter became a moment where the real strength was revealed, not through force, but through intellectual prowess. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension as the questioning began. A figure known for their authority and experience took their position and began speaking with a tone that was sharp and calculated. It wasn't just the usual formal questioning. This had a deeper intention. The questions came quickly, without room for hesitation. The tone of voice used was one that could make anyone feel uneasy, as though the person being questioned had to justify every word they said. It wasn't just about gathering information. It was about making the other party feel the pressure, making them work harder to respond, and testing their ability to handle such a forceful approach. The questions that were asked were complicated and required a deep understanding of legal principles. They were not easy to answer, especially when they came at a pace that left little time to pause and think. Each question seemed to layer the pressure, and with every new inquiry it became clear that the goal was not only to test knowledge, but also to rattle the person on the receiving end. The seasoned figure was making it clear they expected precision and expertise, but they were also seeking something more. They wanted to see how the other party would respond under pressure, how well they could keep their composure while being challenged so intensely. It would have been easy for anyone to feel overwhelmed. The questions were meant to catch the other party off guard, to expose weaknesses or cracks in their legal understanding. They were designed to be complex enough that anyone could get lost in the details or falter in their answers. But what was remarkable was the way the person on the receiving end approached the situation. Instead of becoming defensive or flustered, they stood their ground. They didn't try to avoid the pressure. Instead, they embraced it and responded with an unexpected level of calm. The answers that followed were not hurried or uncertain. Each one was well thought out, clear, and delivered with confidence. There was no sense of hesitation in their voice, no moment of doubt in the words spoken. In fact, it became apparent with every answer that the person knew exactly what they were talking about. They weren't just answering questions, they were dissecting them. They broke down each question with precision, addressing the legal principles at its core. It was clear that they understood not just the facts, but the broader implications behind every inquiry. What was most striking was the way the responses shifted the energy in the room. What had started as a one-sided exchange, with one person clearly in control, began to feel more like a balanced conversation. The power dynamics, which had initially been defined by authority, were no longer so clear-cut. The person being questioned was not simply defending themselves, they were taking charge of the conversation. Every response was an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge and expertise, and it was becoming increasingly clear that they were in complete control of the dialogue. As the questions grew more complex, the responses grew stronger. What had started as an attempt to put pressure on the other party had now turned into an educational moment. The atmosphere, which had felt tense and filled with expectation, slowly shifted. The questioning figure, who had hoped to dominate the conversation, found themselves facing an entirely different situation. The power they had tried to exert with their questions was slowly dissipating, as each answer revealed the depth of the other party's legal expertise. The original goal of the questioning seemed to be slipping away. What had been an attempt at dominance had turned into an exchange of knowledge and insight. The room, which had been filled with the sound of sharp questions and pointed inquiries, now felt quieter. As the answers came, people in the room began to realize that they were witnessing something rare. Instead of seeing someone crumble under pressure, they were seeing a display of mastery. The person being questioned wasn't just keeping up, they were leading the conversation. It was no longer about the questions being asked, it was about how well the person answering was handling the situation. Their ability to remain composed and provide thoughtful, thorough answers was becoming the focal point. With each answer, the seasoned figure's tone softened, and their questions became less forceful. The shift in energy in the room was palpable. The person who had been on the defensive was now in control. What had initially been an intimidating moment was turning into a lesson in confidence, composure, and legal expertise. The figure who had hoped to test the other party's limits was now learning something themselves, something they hadn't anticipated. They were witnessing firsthand what true legal knowledge and confidence looked like in action. The back and forth exchange, once filled with tension, was now a clear display of the power of knowledge. The person being questioned had not only answered each question with clarity, but had done so in a way that made it impossible to ignore their understanding of the law. The shift in power had taken place not through force or pressure, but through calm, composed responses and a mastery of the subject matter that couldn't be dismissed. What had begun as an effort to intimidate had now become a demonstration of intellectual strength. As the conversation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the person being questioned was not only holding their ground, but was also turning the exchange into something more profound. What had started as a one-sided attempt to assert dominance quickly turned into a demonstration of how powerful, well-thought-out responses can be. Each question, once an opportunity for the authority figure to challenge the other person, became a platform for them to showcase their exceptional understanding of the law. The first few moments of tension were palpable. It was clear that the person being questioned had been placed in an uncomfortable position. The rapid-fire questions, designed to catch them off guard or force them to make a mistake, seemed to create a high-pressure environment. However, instead of feeling the weight of the moment, the individual responded with a calm assurance. With every question, they took a deep breath, gathered their thoughts, and delivered an answer that was both concise and powerful. It was as if the pressure only sharpened their focus, helping them to articulate their legal knowledge with even greater precision. The responses were not only correct, but also filled with insights that revealed a deeper level of understanding. It became apparent that this wasn't just a simple back and forth about legal points. The person answering the questions was breaking down complex issues in ways that made them more accessible, showing not just a command of the facts, but also an ability to connect the dots between theory and practice. What started as an attempt to rattle them had turned into an opportunity to teach, to explain, and to shift the conversation into a more enlightening direction. In each of their responses, they demonstrated a thorough understanding of not just the surface details, but the underlying principles that shaped the legal framework they were discussing. It was clear they weren't just repeating memorized information. They were thinking critically, processing each question as it was asked, and using the moment to offer real insight. The person being questioned was no longer simply defending their position. They were in control, leading the conversation with authority grounded in knowledge. This shift in power was subtle at first, but it became more noticeable as the questions continued. The room, initially filled with the sharp tone of questioning, now began to reflect a different energy. What had been an intimidating atmosphere was starting to shift. The answers were no longer mere defenses, but clear explanations that illuminated complex topics. The seasoned figure, who had come into the exchange with the intention of maintaining control, was now faced with a situation where their questions seemed almost secondary to the knowledge and confidence being displayed in the answers. The dynamic of the exchange had changed. It wasn't just about who had the louder voice or more experience anymore. It was about who could articulate their point more clearly, who had the deeper understanding of the subject at hand. And with every response, it became clear that the person being questioned was far more than capable. They were demonstrating an impressive grasp of the law, The authority figure, who had initially used their position to try and dominate the conversation, was now finding themselves in a position where they had to listen and process the well-crafted responses. It was as if the tables had turned, and the power of knowledge was what commanded the room. What was especially striking was how the person being questioned handled the pressure. Despite the challenging questions, despite the attempts to unsettle them, they didn't falter. They didn't rush or seem flustered. They took their time, answering each question thoughtfully and with precision. It wasn't about speed or being the first to speak. It was about speaking clearly, calmly, and with purpose. Their responses were not just about proving they knew the law. They were about showing the depth of their understanding. It was a quiet confidence, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. It stood firm, unwavering in the face of pressure, and it demanded attention through the quality of its substance. As the exchange continued, it became clear that the questions were no longer just about testing the individual. They had shifted into a dialogue, a true exchange of ideas. The authority figure, who had initially hoped to put the other person in a position of disadvantage, now found themselves engaged in a meaningful conversation about the law. They were no longer in control, but they had also realized that the direction of the conversation was no longer something they could easily steer. The answers they had received were too well constructed, too insightful to ignore. In the end, it wasn't just a battle of knowledge. It was a battle of composure and confidence. The person being questioned had not only maintained their cool under pressure, but had used the opportunity to show the full extent of their expertise. Every answer they gave helped to define the space they were occupying in that moment. It wasn't a space of submission, but one of authority, a quiet authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. This was a moment where knowledge truly spoke for itself, where being well prepared and composed proved to be the most powerful tool in the room. As the exchange continued, it was clear that the atmosphere in the room had changed. What began as a tense and confrontational session, filled with sharp questions and an almost palpable pressure, was now shifting in an unexpected direction. The intensity that had filled the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new sense of respect. The person being questioned had responded with such confidence and clarity that it was becoming difficult for anyone to deny the strength of their knowledge. What had initially seemed like an attempt to overwhelm and intimidate had turned into an opportunity for the other person to demonstrate their exceptional understanding of the law. The shift in the room's energy was subtle at first, but gradually became more apparent. Those observing the exchange, who might have originally been focused on the authority figure's position, began to notice the power of the other individual's responses. Every time they answered a question, they did so with poise, offering insights that were both deeply rooted in legal principles and articulated in a way that made even complex ideas easy to understand. It was a skill few could manage under such pressure. Instead of showing any signs of vulnerability or hesitation, the individual displayed a level of expertise that turned the entire conversation around. As the back and forth continued, it became increasingly clear that the once dominant authority figure was now in a position where they had to listen more closely. Their questions, which had once seemed to carry weight, now appeared almost secondary to the responses they were receiving. The clarity of the answers not only demonstrated a strong command of the subject matter, but also a level of preparation and knowledge that could not be easily ignored. It was almost as if the more the person being questioned spoke, the more the room recognized their intellectual authority. What had begun as an attempt to undermine or challenge was now a clear exhibition of strength. The questions that had been asked were no longer seen as tests to expose flaws, but as opportunities for the person being questioned to explain and educate. There was no rush to get through them. Instead, each response was given the care it deserved. Every legal principle and precedent mentioned was backed by facts, making the answers even more compelling. With each answer, it became more difficult for anyone to see the individual as anything other than someone fully in command of the situation. The balance of power had shifted. No longer was the authority figure seen as the one controlling the conversation. Now, the person being questioned had become the one guiding the discussion. It was not just the answers that were impressive, It was also the manner in which they were delivered. There was no sense of defensiveness in the way the responses were phrased. There was no hesitation, no attempt to dodge or deflect. The individual took each question seriously, addressed it with precision, and moved on to the next without any sign of uncertainty. It was a display of mastery, not only of the law but of how to navigate high-pressure situations with calmness and confidence. The ability to remain composed, especially when under such scrutiny, is a quality that sets individuals apart. It's easy to be confident when things are going well, but true strength is shown in moments when one is pushed to the limit. With each passing moment, the room grew quieter. The energy had shifted from tension and pressure to respect and admiration. The authority figure, who had hoped to use their experience and status to dominate the conversation, now found themselves in a position of learning. They were no longer leading the discussion. Instead, they were absorbing the well-reasoned explanations and insightful responses being offered. It wasn't that the authority figure had lost control, it was that the focus had shifted. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate or challenge was now a shared exchange of ideas, and the individual who had been questioned was coming out as the clear intellectual leader. The transformation was remarkable. In the beginning, the authority figure had used sharp questions to try and expose weaknesses, but with each answer it became clearer that there were no weaknesses to find. The person being questioned had not only kept their composure, but had turned the session into a showcase of their legal expertise. It wasn't about the questions anymore. It was about the depth of understanding behind each answer. The way they explained each point made it impossible to ignore their mastery of the subject. The tone of the room had shifted from one of scrutiny to one of appreciation. It was no longer about who was in control of the conversation, but about who had the knowledge to guide it. The change in dynamics was evident to everyone watching. What had initially seemed like an adversarial encounter had become a moment of intellectual clarity. The original goal of the questioning, to dominate the conversation and test the other person's abilities, had been overshadowed by the depth of understanding that was displayed. It became clear that the person being questioned had not only answered each question competently, but had done so with a level of insight that made it impossible to ignore. The respect that had once been held for the authority figure now began to shift towards the person answering the questions. The power of knowledge and preparation had proven to be the deciding factor in the exchange. As the session went on, it became increasingly obvious that the intellectual strength of the individual being questioned had overshadowed the attempts to dominate the conversation. The authority figure had come into the exchange expecting to control the narrative, but it was the responses, the calmness under pressure, and the clear legal expertise that had taken center stage. The room, which had once been filled with tension, now buzzed with admiration for the individual who had stood their ground. The shift was undeniable, and it was clear that, in the end, true authority is not just about holding power, it is about demonstrating the strength of one's knowledge and ability to guide the conversation. As the conversation unfolded, it became evident that the intensity of the initial exchange was gradually diminishing. What had begun as a tense confrontation, with sharp questions and an obvious attempt to pressure the other party, now felt more like a genuine exchange of ideas. The person answering the questions had not only maintained their composure, but had also provided insights that completely shifted the dynamics of the room. What had once been a session of testing and intimidation had now become an opportunity for the person being questioned to demonstrate their full legal expertise. Their responses were not only well-structured but conveyed a depth of understanding that was difficult to ignore. At first, the questions were rapid and designed to unsettle. They were framed to catch the other party off guard, perhaps in the hope of revealing a gap in their knowledge or to make them slip up. The individual being questioned could have easily become defensive, trying to guard against the pressure. Instead, they embraced the challenge, responding with clear and confident answers. They didn't rush or falter. They took their time to understand each question fully, and then responded in a way that not only addressed the query but also showed their grasp of the broader legal context. Each response was an opportunity to educate, to explain, and to assert their expertise in a calm and reasoned manner. As the back and forth continued, it became increasingly clear that the person being questioned was not merely reacting to the questions, they were controlling the flow of the conversation. While the authority figure had initially come into the exchange with the intention of dominating the discussion, it was the individual answering the questions who now seemed to be steering the direction of the dialogue. The questions, which had initially been used to challenge, were now met with responses that were not only precise, but also revealed a deeper understanding of the legal concepts at play. The authority figure, who had hoped to remain in control, now found themselves absorbed in the clarity and depth of the other person's answers. The tone of the room began to shift too. What had started as a tense and high-pressure interaction was now becoming more of a respectful exchange. As the person being questioned continued to answer thoughtfully and confidently, it became difficult for anyone in the room to ignore their intellectual authority. The air, once thick with tension, was now filled with an appreciation for the expertise being shared. The person who had been questioned was no longer seen as on the defensive. Instead, they were viewed as the one with the answers, clear, concise, and rooted in deep knowledge. This transformation was not just about the answers themselves, but about how they were delivered. Every response was measured, well thought out, and backed by solid reasoning. The more questions that were asked, the more the authority figure seemed to realize that their initial approach was not going to achieve the desired outcome. What had seemed like a simple test of knowledge had turned into an exhibition of the individual's ability to navigate complex legal matters with ease and precision. The authority figure, who had initially sought to impose control through sharp questioning, now found themselves listening intently, perhaps even learning from the responses. The dynamic had shifted so much that it was clear the person being questioned was no longer the one on trial. Instead, they had taken control of the narrative, using the moment to shine a light on their legal expertise and their ability to handle pressure. The authority figure had hoped to challenge, to find cracks in the other party's knowledge. But instead, they had inadvertently opened the door for the individual to demonstrate the depth of their understanding. Each response provided more than just an answer. It provided a lesson in legal principles and the ability to think critically under pressure. What had been an attempt at intimidation had turned into an opportunity for the person being questioned to showcase their abilities in a way that made it impossible for anyone in the room to underestimate them. This shift in the room's energy was not only apparent in the questions and answers, but also in the way everyone in the room began to pay closer attention. The authority figure, who had come into the exchange with confidence, now seemed to be listening more than speaking. The questions they had asked, once intended to catch the other party off guard, were now met with responses that required the authority figure to take a step back and consider the bigger picture. What had begun as an interrogation had transformed into a dialogue, a conversation where the person being questioned was not just defending their position, but leading the way with their clear explanations and impressive legal knowledge. The transformation in the room was not just about knowledge, it was about how knowledge was being used. The person being questioned wasn't merely answering questions, they were reframing the conversation, offering new perspectives, and displaying a level of expertise that commanded respect. This was not a simple test of knowledge. It was a demonstration of how knowledge, when applied thoughtfully, could shift the power dynamics of a conversation. The authority figure had come into the exchange expecting to be the one in control, but it was the person being questioned who, with every well-reasoned response, had gradually assumed the position of leadership in the discussion. By the time the exchange drew to a close, it was clear that the initial dynamics had been completely overturned. The authority figure, who had hoped to assert dominance through their sharp questioning, had found themselves in the position of learning from the person they had initially tried to challenge. The shift in power had not come through force or confrontation. It had come through the strength of knowledge, the calmness under pressure, and the clarity of the responses. It was a reminder that true authority is not about asserting power over others, but about demonstrating the depth of one's understanding and the ability to guide others through complex ideas with confidence and ease.